Howdy folks, I'm Mark Rutan and welcome back to Nomad Boatbuilding. Now today on our Gannet project I want to talk about Lapstrake planking. Now the term Lapstrake planking refers to one plank lapping over another plank in order to create the structure of your boat. What I love about Lapstrake planking, and especially glued Lapstrake planking, is it's interesting to do. It does require a little bit of skill and practice, but it's very achievable. And in particular, I like glued Lapstrake planking because we don't need to use a massive amount of epoxy to achieve a good structural boat. We don't need to use fiberglass to create structure the way we would with a strip-built boat that requires fiberglass inside and out in order to maintain that structural stability. I'll make the argument that it's even easier to do than strip building. Forming those planks and connecting them together is interesting and not overly challenging. Especially when we're using epoxy as an adhesive, we've got a lot of wiggle room. Even though I'm going to go into the nuances of how to bevel laps and how to get things just perfect, we don't have to make them perfect in order to make this work. The difference between making it perfect and making it structural is just the volume of epoxy we need to use. So all in all, I think it makes for a more enjoyable, more interesting building process. And each plank gives you a real sense of satisfaction because each plank represents another big step in the process in order to get your boat planked up. It's quite reasonable to get one pair of planks fitted and hung in one day. And so the whole process of building your boat, or at least building the hull, outside of building the backbone and the molds and all of that sort of stuff, can be achieved in about a week's time, depending on the boat you're building. So let's just jump into the first part of our process, which is beveling off our plank laps. Now, whenever you're building a Lapstrake boat, one of the primary activities you do is preparing the surface that exists to accept the plank that you're going to put on that. And to that end, we need to bevel the existing plank in order to accept the new plank and then we have to cut gains at the stem and at the transom in order for those planks to come together into the same plane. Now sometimes at the transom we'll let the planks joggle onto each other. That has to do with whether or not we've actually joggled the transom in order to accept full thickness planks back there. On our transom we did joggle it, but it was joggled to accept 1/4 inch thick planking, and we're using 3/8 thick planking, so we still need to do some gain cutting. It's not a lot of work, so we'll take care of that when we get to it. The joggles in this planking were designed around 1/4 inch planks. I had already sort of moved on, not thinking the fact that I was using 3/8 planks instead, and that these would have to be different. So I guess the joggles were supposed to eliminate having to notch the planks, having to do gains, and I've sort of got the worst of both worlds, where I had to cut both the joggles and I have to cut gains. Not really the end of the world. I mean, it didn't take a ton of time. Now, whether you're starting with a bare backbone or whether you've got planks on the boat, the process is pretty much the same. The backbone needs to be beveled off. That is, the keelson and the stem faces need to be beveled off to accept the planking. And once you've done that, then we're on to planking. You should have left a little bit of meat on your stem in order to make sure that those planks are fitting properly. Maybe like 1/16 of an inch is plenty. That's because you can't always anticipate exactly how the planks are going to land. And that's because a batten and planking are going to bend differently. Now, beveling the laps is very similar to some of the techniques that we used when we were fairing our backbone, but I feel there are some subtle nuances that are worth extra attention, and I'm going to offer up some alternatives for those of you who are still struggling to develop their skills with sharpened edge tools. So let me now just walk you through how I go about doing the beveling process on a Lapstrake boat. In some cases, you might have done a battened mold, which means that you've got battens that represent the plank laps built into the mold running the full length of the boat, and you can use a little gauge on your block plane that will adjust the angle of the plane as you plane off that bevel. That's a great tool, and I use that all the time. I didn't do a battened mold in this case, and so I need to work out those bevels slightly differently. Now, it's not really difficult to do. If you have reasonably good control of your ability to hold an angle with your plane, you can do this no problem. And because we're using thickened epoxy in this type of construction, that is glued Lapstrake construction, there's plenty of wiggle room to make up for mistakes. Now, this process is exactly the same whether it's glued Lapstrake planking or traditional mechanically fastened planking. But in the case of the latter, we need to be much fussier about how those planks fit together. There's really no room for errors exactly, unless you want to use a thickened adhesive in those laps, like polyurethane in a caulking tube type material. Now, I have heard of some people using epoxy for gluing solid plank Lapstrake boats. I've always been led to believe that that's not a good idea, that that's problematic. I might be wrong about that though, because I have seen people who are doing it and doing it successfully. But I've never done that, and so I'm not going to recommend doing it because I don't have that first-hand experience. Anyhow, let's get down to beveling this boat, and I typically like to just start at the transom. All right, the first thing we're going to need to do is mark our lap width on our planks. You can certainly use a combination square for doing that, but a better idea is to make a little fid, any little tool, measuring tool that has to do with our planking process, a fid. So here is like a multi-purpose plank fid. It is the thickness of my planking here, so that's important. In this case it's 3/8. And then over here I've got a little notch cut onto it. We call this a jump stick, and it allows me to sort of see how lines interact with this face around an obstruction, so the corner of a plank for instance. And on the other end I've got a little notch here that is my plank lap. So in this case it's 3/4 of an inch deep, and it doesn't matter about the depth of the notch right this way because it just has to lap over the edge of the plank. So one plank fid that's a little bit longer than the widest plank that you have on the boat, and it has several features on it that we can use throughout the boat building process. And so we want to run that all the way down the boat from stem to stern. And the same fid could be used to work out the bevel. The bevel we need to achieve is whatever is the result of touching off a straight line between one of our plank layout lines and that line we've just put on here for our plank bevel. So if we lay a stick across there, and we look at the gap right here, this is the amount that we need to remove from the edge. Now, some people will go to the trouble of trying to mark that distance on the edge of the plank.
In our last episode on fairing the backbone, I explained how you would use your jump stick in order to mark the edge of a plank or the edge of your keelson.
I don't bother with that. It's fussy and there's not a really good reason to do it, because you should be checking your progress as you plane and just working your way down to that line slowly. If you just go ahead and put some layout lines on there and hog your way right down to them, chances are you're going to overshoot your line. So usually I'll go around the boat and I'll just have a look at how the bevels are changing to give myself sort of a feel for it. Using a block plane or a smoothing plane, depending on the size of the boat and how much curve it's got, we're going to use that for doing our beveling. What I'll usually do is I will take a stick like this and lay it on here, get a feel for what angle it is that I need. Rather than walking all the way down the length of the boat with a winding bevel, which I would do if I had a batten on here, I find it's easier to just stay in one spot and get it down about 3/4 of the way to start with. Every now and then I stop and I check. I can use the sole of my plane to see what my progress is and if my angle's good. I gotta bring it down quite a bit more here. That's getting closer. And I'll come about halfway to the next station. I won't worry about trying to get that bevel all the way down at the halfway point, but I'll let it taper out in that direction. The bevel's looking pretty good, a little more. Back here at the transom, we're actually going to have a gain, so that's going to affect the angle here, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm just trying to get close to the line for now. Now let's move on to the next one.
As I'm checking the bevels of my plane, I want to emphasize that I'm putting the toe of the plane on the marking that represents the outboard edge of the next plank as it's marked on the mold.
Notice how far I go before I check again. I'm checking very frequently. Okay, now when I'm real close, I've got maybe little less than 1/8 from my line here. I'm just going to stop right there because there's going to be some more fine tuning that's going to happen as I roll this bevel into whatever that bevel is. And I want a little bit of wiggle room to bring that ramp down and then finish it off. Okay, I'm there. Let's move on to this one. So notice I'm coming about halfway and going about halfway. It's like one full stretch of my arms. Check my bevel, and I'm too steep, so I gotta crank it a little bit. You can feel the bevel you got, and then tip your plane slightly to try and feel the new one. Take a few strokes and check your progress. Gotta go a little more. Now I'm starting to run out of room here to adjust my angle, so I gotta be really careful, and I'm still too low, so gotta yeah, I'm running out of space now. Check my plane. I think I'm taking too heavy a bite off one side. That's my problem. My plane was not adjusted well. So now I've got very little room to correct this bevel. Now luckily with Lapstrake planking, we can overshoot our line a little bit. It's not going to be the end of the world. There we go. That's fixed it up. Mark my line. So now I've got a bevel here and I've got a bevel here, and they're slightly different. So if I feel this one, and then I come over here and I feel this one, I want to try and get a feel for what the difference is. There. Okay, so what I want to do is find the sort of halfway mark between those two and address this hump in the middle. Take a few strokes, then I'll go back and I'll do the same thing again. Try and find that happy medium, and I can use the veneers as a guide, but don't trust that they're 100% even. Depending on how they were sanded out at the factory, they're going to have a little bit of inconsistency. So now when I think I'm close, I've still got a few spots on either side that aren't quite right, so I'll come back here to the first one. I'll lock in that angle. And I'll try and push it through. I'll do the same thing back here. And then I'll come back to my middle one, finish that off, and then try and finish off with a few strokes that roll all the way through those three angles. Try not to eat your line, and then come down and you sight along the edge, make sure that looks fair, and then check your surfaces to make sure you don't have a hump in the middle of that lap. If it all looks good, you're done. And when you're done, you should be able to touch your plank line there and touch your bevel line there at both spots and not see any light between your plane and that bevel. If you feel along there, it should feel pretty good. Now, if you're struggling with a block plane, okay, now you could do it with abrasives. I don't recommend it because it's going to be tedious as hell. If you can't sharpen a block plane to save your life, it's quite doable. Make yourself a little simple abrasive stick like this. Use it to check our angle. In fact, you could use it like this to lay out the line. I don't have my lap line drawn on here. If there's one reason to not do this is because it's harder to see your progress than it is with a block plane. A block plane leaves this surface that's noticeably different in the way the light reflects off of it, and it makes it easy to see your bevel. You don't get that with an abrasive. There we are, I'm real close. And again, you just lock in that bevel, carry it further, use the veneer lines to help guide your progress. Now there's another alternative to using abrasives, and that's using a drywaller's rasp. It's pretty rough and ugly, but I do know a guy that could not sharpen a block plane to save his life, and he used a drywaller's rasp for all of his planing duties on a Lapstrake boat like this. It worked out just fine. I couldn't dig mine out of the pile, it's buried too deep, but I just want you to know that there are alternatives to using sharpened edge tools. Now you could use a belt sander for this, I suppose, but I think it'd be kind of ugly and the chances you're going to overshoot are pretty strong. But if that's your jam, then go for it. A good sharp edge tool is the superior tool to use for this. Getting familiar with and getting proficient with good sharp edge tools is by far your best path to having fun with wooden boat building. I think the most important rule is to keep checking your work as you go. Mistakes are going to happen when you just get too ambitious and you overshoot your marks. If you're liking these videos, you can support me by giving me a thumbs up, throwing me a couple of bucks for super thanks, subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, and of course, you can join me over on Patreon. Find links in the corner or down in the description. Okay, a trick you can use is by having a little stick extension onto your block plane. So I've just drilled and tapped a hole on the side of my plane here, right around the throat. And I screw this little stick on here. And so the idea is that this stick can represent your plank lap. Now I've got these sticks in several different lengths. This one here, the shorter one, probably is more representative of what I need for these particular planks. Put the shorty on here for a second. So this is a better example of one that's long enough to reach my plank lap and give me the right angle for this particular location. But I find these sticks kind of get in the way most of the time. They're fine when you've got a batten on here that's let into the molds or that's sitting below the planking line, and then that can ride right on the batten and follow it along. Now there's a variation on that where you can just add a batten onto the mold here, onto the outside, and you'd have to have a stick like this that has got a step in it that allows the stick to ride up over the top of that batten. So essentially you'd have to have an extension stick like this, and that's the thickness of the batten right here. And if you did that, then you could follow along. Now I find that's all kind of fussy. I don't personally need it, but I've certainly employed that. Or you can just have a batten on here and have a joggled stick like this as a guide stick, just like your plank fid. Just chop a notch into your plank fid that represents your batten thickness, and then you can just quickly check your progress as you go while you plane freehand. When I'm teaching Lapstrake courses, that's what I do with my students. We just tack on a light batten that just generally represents that plank line, and then we use that little fid to just check how we're doing. Okay, now if you're really unsure how you're doing, there's another thing we can do to check. So you could take a piece of planking that's the right width. The width is important. You need to make sure that it's touching off on these marks over here. And you can just bend that across between a couple of stations and just have a look. And just make sure that you're seeing no gap on this side and no gap on the other side. Now, if you're seeing a gap on one, it probably means you need to take off some material on the other. Now, if you find that the top is tight, but the bottom has got a gap, that means you overshot your line. And you need to fix that. If we're doing glued Lapstrake with thickened epoxy, you could get away with just putting a heavier bead of epoxy in so that it just fills. If you're doing traditional Lapstrake planking and you need to fix that, you're going to need to back bevel your planks. So that means you need to have a plank lap line on the inside so that you can see what you're doing. And what you would do is you look at the amount of gap you have, and we'll say it's like a 32nd of an inch. That means on the plank that you're going to hang, you need to pull about a 32nd of an inch off one edge of that. Now you're not going to do that for the whole plank, you're only going to do that for the area that is showing the gap. What I usually do is I'll have that plank on the boat here, I'll pull it back or lift it up, and I'll just run my block plane on the back side of it, eyeballing the depth of that lap, and just try and take some material off like so. And what you'll generally see is that you're only taking it off on the one edge. It's not going the full depth, right? And you just keep working your way down until you get to that line and you've created a nice flat surface in through there. It might help to actually change the angle of your plane blades such that you're taking off more on the outboard edge and zero on the inboard, and then it's even easier to just quickly dial in that angle. And you just keep tweaking it down until that looks good. And if you find you've really blown it and you cannot get that tightened up properly, rather than going crazy and blowing right through the edge of your plank and whittling it down to nothing, it's a better idea to stop short. Just make sure those surfaces look flattish and use a bead of thickened epoxy or thickened adhesive in that joint. If you try and go too short with this initial beveling, but if you only try and work in a small area, your plane's going to bottom out very quickly and you're going to not be able to achieve that flat surface in here. So you really need to carry it a far enough length that you're maintaining a relatively flat surface throughout enough distance that the plane sole doesn't bottom out. The most important thing is to make sure you're touching your plank lap mark with the heel of your plane when you're checking this bevel. If you're doing it short of that, that's not going to be any good because your plank's not going to touch in the middle of that spacing. It's going to touch out here at the end of your bevel. Throughout the middle of the boat, these bevels are probably going to be about the same from mold to mold. As you get towards the ends of the boat, especially towards the bow, it's going to start changing a lot more and a lot more quickly. So you just need to be more careful towards the bow. The middle of it is pretty much a cakewalk. And I think the last piece of advice I can offer is pay attention to how the shavings are coming out of your plane. If you want to adjust the angle and not throw the angle off entirely, you can make sure that your plane is not able to plane across the whole width of that lap. You can bring it down so just part of your blade is taking some material off in order to control how much you're adjusting that angle, and then you can finish up with a swipe that flattens it all out. And if you find you're having to really push down on your plane in order to get it to bite, that means you really need to stop and sharpen. We don't want to be doing that, because if you're having to push down, you could be flexing this plank between the molds, and that's not going to give you a good result. So the toughest part is all in through here, this first little section of the boat where the planks really take a hard turn, especially in a bluff boat like this. It can be very difficult, especially at this first station, to get the planks to lay down properly. It's quite common, especially up towards the keel, for these to want to flare out a lot because it's hard to get the twist. It's hard to calculate what the twist is going to be, and it's not uncommon to have these planks starting to pop off your molds a little bit if you're not getting it down properly. So both of these planks are sort of rising off my mold by about 1/16 of an inch or something like that. And I can try and get it to come down and touch my mold on the next plank by beveling down to that point. There's a good chance though I might bevel down to that and I bend the next plank on, and it just does not want to twist down and lay down to that spot. And that just, I think it's just a physical impossibility, and it has to do with the amount that you can actually twist the plank up here at the bow in order to get it to fall into line back here. So sometimes a bunch of back beveling is required to try and get this as close as you can get it. So for that reason, as I'm getting close down to here, I'm looking at that line. I'm going to bring it down pretty close to that, but I might leave a little bit of meat after I get the plank in place and I start cutting my gain. Then I can start finagling all of this down, and I can figure out what I need to do to try and get this plank to settle in properly. Just know that if you take it right down to this line, you might find yourself with this gap on the back side right in through here that you just cannot get it to close up. And the only way to do that is by back beveling. Also remember that as you work your way down to the line here, this attitude changes. It changes from where it's lying when the plank is touching at its unplaned edge, and then as you bring it down, that attitude is changing a little bit, and so that's going to adjust the angle of that bevel a little bit. So that's angle's just perfect right now. I still need to back bevel back here, but I'm going to just show you that I'll take this angle right now and just carry it forward. Now I've still got a screw here holding the hood end of the plank down. I can pull that out now. It's been overnight that this has been glued, so I'm confident it'll stay put. But there's a lot of twist in here, and so you got to be careful that you aren't pulling this out prematurely. Now from here on out, it's going to get a gain cut into it, so we'll just leave that alone. I ate my pencil on a little bit, so I want to put that back in. That's as far as I can take this right now. Now I'll work my way back and finish off this bevel right here. This is also a good area to leave just a little bit of meat behind for when our plank is in place and we can check how that bevel is actually doing, because again, it's hard to anticipate what the twist is really going to do in through here. A really stiff plank like these 3/8 planks compared to a 1/4 inch plank is going to react a little differently and be a little more prone to wanting to fight its position in terms of how the bevel lands. Now that we have our laps mostly beveled, the next step in the process is cutting the gains, but we're going to save that for the next episode. Now I'm sure you saw some crossover between beveling the backbone and beveling the laps. That's just fine because they are essentially the same thing. However, beveling the laps is kind of a major process through the Lapstrake building process, and so I felt like it needed its own episode anyway. Now because I want to break this process into separate distinct elements, you're going to see the boat itself in different stages of the planking process. Don't let that throw you off. There's a bit of a chicken and egg situation when it comes to showing you this bit and that bit. It doesn't all flow from start to finish exactly, especially the way that I filmed it. So just understand that you haven't missed anything. We're going to cover all the basic elements of how to plank the boat from start to finish. It's just not going to start with like the bottom plank and end with the top plank. I just want to thank all my followers on Patreon for making these videos possible. If you can help me out on Patreon, I really appreciate that. You can find links in the corner or down in the description. Alright folks, we'll see you on the next one.